London, 1845. The city wakes not to sunshine, but to a suffocating blanket of fog, rolling thick between the narrow streets like slow-moving smoke from some unseen fire. It is the kind of fog that makes the air taste faintly of soot and river water, the kind that swallows outlines of buildings and turns every passerby into a shifting silhouette. Gas lamps glow dimly through the mist, their weak halos pooling against the darkness like fading embers. The morning is not silent, London is never silent, but the sounds are muted, wrapped in dampness. The calls of market vendors seem to drift rather than ring, the clop of hooves on cobblestones is dull and echoless, and somewhere a bell tolls, its iron voice swallowed before it can travel far. On Paternoster Row, where the narrow lanes wind between the shadowed spines of bookshops and printing houses, the day should have begun with the familiar rhythms of carts arriving, porters unloading paper, and apprentices hurrying in with ink-stained fingers. Instead, a small knot of people has gathered outside a modest brick townhouse, their shapes indistinct in the gloom. No one speaks in full sentences, there are only murmured fragments, passed between hunched shoulders and upturned collars. "Have you seen her?" one voice whispers. Not once in days." Another mutters something about punishment, though it is unclear whether the speaker means divine or self-inflicted. A young boy, the apprentice to a nearby printer, stands at the edge of the crowd, craning his neck toward an upstairs window. Behind its warped glass and half-drawn curtains, the faint glow of a candle flickers. It is said the girl sits there every morning, unmoving, before a small oval mirror on a dressing table. She will look at the wall behind it, at the floor beside it, at her hands folded in her lap, but never at the glass itself. The crowd's curiosity is sharpened by the peculiarity of the act. Refusing food or speech is one thing, refusing your own reflection is another, and in 1845 it is not easily explained. Some here speak of vanity turned to madness, a cautionary tale for daughters who linger too long before the looking-glass. Others whisper of a darker possibility, that the girl has seen something in her reflection that does not belong to her, and that she will not look again for fear it might return. Inside, the air is warmer but carries the faint metallic tang of the coal grate. In the upstairs bedroom, the pale winter light filters weakly through the curtains. The mirror sits on a narrow table, its frame unremarkable, dark wood, slightly chipped at the edges, the kind you might find in any working family's home. Before it sits Clara Whitcomb, 13 years old, her thin shoulders drawn tight beneath a wool shawl. Her brown hair, unbrushed since the previous evening, catches the candlelight in uneven strands. Her eyes, large and restless, flicker across the room, pausing on the fireplace tiles, the pattern in the carpet, the faint cracks in the plaster ceiling, but they never once cross the center of the glass. Her mother hovers in the doorway, speaking softly but with an edge of frustration. "It is only your own face, Clara. There is nothing there to harm you." Clara says nothing. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, tighten until the knuckles blanch. She shifts slightly, turning the line of her sight toward the far corner of the room, as though the mirror were a bright light she must avoid at all cost. This is not the first morning of the ritual, nor the second, nor the fifth. It has been weeks, perhaps longer, since anyone in the Whitcomb family has seen Clara meet her own gaze in a looking-glass. The change came without warning, without the sort of gradual unease that might allow a parent to intercept it early. One day she dressed for Sunday service as she always had, fastening the ribbon of her bonnet before the mirror. The next, she could not be coaxed to glance at her reflection at all. Downstairs, her father tends to the small fire in the parlor. A bookbinder. By trade, he is more accustomed to solving practical problems, loose spines, torn pages, the ordering of accounts, than the abstract illnesses of the mind. Yet the longer the silence stretches between Clara and the mirror, the more he feels the weight of something intangible pressing against the household. The servants speak of it in hushed tones, even the neighbors, who once greeted him with nods and brief pleasantries, now watch him as if expecting an explanation he cannot give. Beyond the house, London carries on, indifferent. Omnibuses rattle through Cheapside, their passengers half hidden behind veils of fog. The smells of damp wool, fresh bread, and coal smoke mingle in the air. But here, in this small upstairs room, time seems to slow. Each moment Clara refuses to look is a moment suspended, like a page half turned and left to yellow. The crowd outside grows restless. A woman in a bonnet pulled low against the cold mutters that the child should be prayed over, before it festers. An older man claims he once knew of a girl in Whitechapel who saw the devil standing behind her in a glass, claims she never spoke again after that day. Whether these are memories or inventions, no one challenges him. The fog makes it easy to believe in shadows. Inside, Clara rises at last from her chair. She walks to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer down at the indistinct faces below. She does not wave, does not acknowledge them, but for a moment her own pale face is visible through the glass to those in the street. They see her, but she does not see herself, not in the warped pane, not in the candlelit mirror behind her. The candle flickers, disturbed by a faint draft from the window. For an instant, the light catches the mirror's surface, and in that moment, any passerby glancing up might swear they saw something move within the frame, not a reflection exactly, but the suggestion of one, blurred and distorted, gone before the eye can fix on it. By the time Clara lets the curtain fall, the crowd has begun to disperse, drawn away by the pull of their own errands. But the whispers remain, carried on the damp air. Somewhere in the city, a bell tolls the hour. In the Whitcomb house, the girl returns to her chair, the mirror before her, her gaze anchored firmly to anywhere but the glass. And the fog presses close to the windows, as if listening. To understand the strangeness of Clara Whitcomb's life, one must first understand Paternoster Row as it stood in the mid-19th century, before the air raids of a future century would burn it to the ground, before its name was half forgotten outside of publishing circles. In 1845, it was a narrow artery beating in time with the pulse of the London book trade. Tall, slightly leaning buildings pressed in on both sides, their shopfronts stacked with volumes bound in calfskin and cloth, the air thick with the scent of ink, paper, and damp wood. Here, between St. Paul's Cathedral and the restless tide of Cheapside, the Whitcomb family made their living. The father, Henry Whitcomb, was a bookbinder of no small skill, his hands square and stained with glue, his eyes sharp enough to catch the faintest misalignment of a spine. His shop occupied the ground floor of their brick townhouse, while the family lived in the modest rooms above. The shop's windows faced the street, displaying not just freshly bound books but the occasional curiosity, a gilded prayer book, a rare atlas, or the illustrated works of Shakespeare, their covers catching the weak daylight like trapped gold. The Whitcombs were not wealthy, but neither were they destitute. In the pecking order of London tradesmen, they occupied a precarious middle rung, respected for their craft, but never far from the anxieties of the next quarter's rent. Henry's wife, Margaret, managed the household with a quiet firmness, stretching shillings with ingenuity and keeping the home's small comforts intact. They had 3 children, Thomas, the eldest, apprenticed to a printer across the street, Lydia, 17, already engaged to a clerk, and Clara, 13, the youngest, still caught between the bright-eyed curiosity of childhood and the quieter shadows of adolescence. Clara was not the kind of child to make herself the center of attention. She had inherited her father's keen observation but turned it inward, preferring the company of her own thoughts to that of the other girls in the row. Where Lydia might spend an afternoon gossiping over ribbons in a draper's shop, Clara could often be found perched in the corner of her father's workspace, sketching the intricate flourishes of bookplates or copying the shapes of the cathedral's towers as seen from their upper window. Her drawings, though lacking formal training, had a precision to them, as if she saw lines and shadows others overlooked. It was in this small world, bounded by the cathedral's looming dome on one side and the busy market lanes on the other, that Clara's life had unfolded with predictable rhythm, until the morning when she first turned her face from the mirror. The Whitcomb home was not without mirrors. There was the oval glass in Clara's bedroom, a small rectangular one in the hallway, and a larger piece, slightly warped with age, above the parlor mantel. None of them were grand objects, they were practical things, meant for quick glances before church or visitors. But they were woven into the fabric of daily life, as unremarkable as the bread at supper or the bells of St. Paul's ringing the hours. Clara's sudden refusal to meet her own eyes in any of them disrupted more than just routine, it unsettled the very balance of the household. In those first days, her mother treated it lightly, believing it a passing fancy. "She's at an age," Margaret remarked to a neighbor, "where a girl can grow overly concerned about appearances." But this theory failed under scrutiny. Clara did not avoid mirrors out of embarrassment, she did not fidget with her hair or fret over a blemish. Instead, her avoidance was absolute, a deliberate redirection of her gaze, as if the glass were not a tool for vanity but a trap. Henry, for his part, considered the matter with the same methodical patience he applied to his craft. He asked questions in the quiet after supper. Was it a dream she'd had? Something she'd read in one of the books? Had someone said something to her in the street? Clara would only shake her head, eyes lowered. If pressed further, she would say, softly, so that he had to lean forward to hear, that she simply did not wish to. And then the conversation would end. Her siblings reacted in ways that mirrored their own temperaments. Thomas, practical and impatient, dismissed it as nonsense and went back to his apprenticeship. Lydia, whose world revolved around propriety and appearances, found it unsettling. She began to position herself carefully in the hallway mirror, angling to catch a glimpse of Clara in the background, a glimpse that never came, for Clara would always slip out of frame before her reflection could be trapped alongside her sister's. Yet despite the strange new habit, Clara carried on with other parts of her life. She still accompanied her mother to the grocer's, still fetched parcels from the printer's shop, still curled up in the window seat with her sketchbook. It was as though the avoidance of mirrors existed in a sealed compartment, a private decision walled off from the rest of her days. That secrecy, more than the act itself, began to gnaw at the family. Life on Paternoster Row is never entirely private. The cramped geography of the street ensures that a closed curtain invites more speculation than an open one. Neighbors noticed Clara's avoidance before the family was ready to explain it. Mrs. Pennington, who ran a small tea shop 2 doors down, mentioned over a cup of tea that she'd seen Clara turn her head sharply when passing the reflective glass of a shop window. As if the sight of herself might burn her, the woman said, tapping her own cheek with a finger as though marking the spot. Soon, such observations multiplied. The apprentices at Henry's shop began to joke about it, at first in the careless way boys do, then with a sharper edge when they realized their whispers could provoke Clara into flushing or leaving the room. Rumors germinated quickly in the damp air of the row, sprouting theories that ranged from the moralistic, "she's hiding some sin," to the supernatural, "she's been marked." Inside the Whitcomb home, the pressure built quietly. Margaret found herself avoiding the subject altogether, for every failed attempt to coax Clara toward a mirror seemed to widen the gulf between them. Henry retreated into his work, stitching leather and paper with tighter precision, as though binding the spines of books could somehow hold his family together as well. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the great, indifferent expanse of London. Yet in the narrow world of Paternoster Row, it became a point of fixation, a story told in lowered voices over the hiss of the tea urn or the clatter of type in the printing house. Clara Whitcomb, the bookbinder's girl who would not look at herself, was becoming, in her own quiet way, a figure of unease. It happened, as far as anyone could later recall, on a quiet Thursday morning in late November, one of those still, gray days when the light never seems to strengthen, and the air inside the house feels heavy even before the fire has burned down to embers. Margaret Whitcomb had risen early to prepare for an outing. A letter from her sister in Islington had arrived the previous day, and she meant to call on her, taking Clara along for the walk. London mornings in that season demanded layers. Margaret set out Clara's best wool dress and a newly trimmed bonnet, the one with the narrow navy ribbon. Clara had helped choose the ribbon only a fortnight earlier, standing in the haberdasher's with her hands clasped behind her back, examining the colors without fuss. There had been no hint then of what was to come. In the small bedroom at the top of the narrow stairs, Margaret laid the dress across the bed and began fastening the ribbon to the bonnet with neat, practiced hands. The oval mirror on Clara's dressing table, its frame a simple walnut oval, polished smooth by years of dusting, caught the dim light from the single window. Margaret had moved the chair to face it, as she always did, so Clara could see herself while adjusting the fit. When Clara entered, she paused in the doorway, her gaze slipping sideways toward the window, as though the light outside had caught her attention. Margaret gestured to the chair. "Come now, sit. We'll see how this looks." Clara obeyed the summons but took her seat stiffly, keeping her eyes low. Margaret lifted the bonnet and lowered it over her daughter's hair, smoothing stray wisps into place. "There now," she said, reaching for the ribbon ends. "Have a look." She tilted the mirror toward Clara. It was the smallest of movements, so slight Margaret almost missed it, the way Clara's shoulders tensed, her chin dropping a fraction lower. Her eyes, instead of lifting to meet her own reflection, darted toward the far edge of the table, fixing on a spot where the wood grain spiraled into a knot. Margaret tried again, tilting the mirror further. "Look, love. You'll see it suits you." The reaction was quiet but undeniable. Clara's hands came up, not to adjust the bonnet, but to push the mirror gently back toward its upright position, so the glass no longer faced her directly. She did it without looking at it, her gaze still locked on the harmless knot in the wood. Margaret frowned. "Clara, what is this?" "I don't want to," the girl murmured. "Don't want to what?" Her answer was nearly inaudible. "Look." There was no petulance in the tone, no childish defiance, only a strange, flat certainty, as if the decision had been made long before the question was asked. Margaret straightened, the bonnet ribbon dangling between her hands. "Nonsense," she said, forcing a smile. "It's only your own face." But Clara shook her head slowly, still not meeting her own gaze. "Not today." Margaret tried to laugh, but the sound caught in her throat. There was something unnatural about the way Clara kept her head turned just enough to avoid the glass, unnatural in its deliberateness. It was not shyness, it was as if the mirror had become a flame and her eyes were the moth that refused to go near it. The moment stretched. Margaret set the bonnet aside and crouched to meet her daughter's lowered gaze. "Did something frighten you?" she asked. Clara's lips pressed together, a faint tremor running through her fingers. "No," she whispered. Then, after a pause, "I just don't want to see." "See what?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, "It doesn't look right." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Your face." Clara nodded almost imperceptibly. Margaret's first instinct was to assure her this was nonsense, that she looked exactly as she always had. But the words felt too heavy in her mouth. There was something in her daughter's voice, a hollow note beneath the words, that made her own heartbeat quicken. She straightened and moved the mirror aside entirely, telling herself she was being kind, that this was a mood soon to pass. Yet as they prepared to leave, Clara's eyes flicked to the covered mirror as though it were a door someone had locked behind her. They set out into the cold, Margaret hoping the brisk air and chatter of the markets might lift the mood. But as they passed the milliner's shop, Clara kept her head turned away from the tall display glass. At a puddle in the gutter, where the sky and rooftops shimmered faintly in the water, she stepped around without looking down. Margaret noticed each of these small evasions, each one striking her with the quiet precision of a pinprick. By the time they reached Islington, Margaret was determined not to mention it to her sister, not yet. But the moment became fixed in her mind, lodged there like a splinter. When they returned home, she saw to it that Clara's mirror was moved slightly to one side, telling herself this was only temporary. Yet that night, as she passed by Clara's room on her way to bed, she noticed the girl sitting at the window seat, sketchbook in hand. The mirror still sat on the dressing table, angled toward the wall. Clara's eyes never once wandered toward it, not even when she set her pencil down to stretch her fingers. Margaret hesitated in the doorway, feeling an unease she could not name. It was a simple thing, she told herself, a child's whim, a passing quirk. But the words felt fragile in her mind, like thin paper in damp air. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this was not the end of the matter. It was the beginning. It did not take long for the matter to leave the Whitcomb doorstep and enter the metallic breath of the printing house, where words were pressed into paper faster than prudence could restrain them. Paternoster Row possessed everything rumor required: narrow distances, quick eyes, and the patient boredom of men who stand long hours over lead. Apprentices became couriers, carrying proofs one way and whispers the other. They watched Clara tilt her face away from the draper's window, circle puddles without looking, and pass the parlor mantel as though its dim mirror were a stove door left open on a summer day. The presses clattered, iron on iron, like teeth. In that relentless percussion the tale learned confidence. The bookbinder's girl refuses the mirror, one boy announced while setting a line of type with neat, stabbing motions. Vanity punished, a compositor declared, polishing spectacles that only smeared. Shame, said a third, squinting along a column with a blackened thumbnail. Judgment cost less than curiosity and yielded quicker pleasure. By noon the rumor had crossed the shop floor to the foreman's desk and settled on a fresh sheet of paper like dust. The foreman, practical and not unkind, frowned and chewed an unlit pipe. He remembered Henry Whitcomb as fair in his accounts, a man who insisted on square corners and clean glue. Trouble in such a house felt indecent, like a smudge on a holy page. That evening he mentioned the matter to his wife. She measured tea with a thrifty spoon and repeated it to a neighbor, who passed it to a cousin serving a curate. The simple fact collected a chapel's echo by nightfall. The curate arrived the next day, collar bright as bone against coal-striped air. He claimed only the child's soul concerned him. Mirrors, he said, snare the vain. Scripture warns the heart against self-regard. Perhaps her refusal was not illness but grace, an instinctive recoil from temptation. Margaret Whitcomb stood straight, hands clasped, and received the counsel with rigid courtesy. She agreed to cover the parlor mirror for a week. The curate departed satisfied, leaving a draft of sanctimony behind the door. The Row, however, was parish only by halves. It was also trade, and trades breed pragmatists. Mr. Fallow, the spectacle seller, sniffed at the clerical theory. The glass shows what stands before it, he told a knot of printers, rubbing a lens on chamois until it squeaked. If the child fears it, something is wrong in the seeing. Eyes double, edges shimmer, the brain lies about angles. Blame the instrument, not the soul. He displayed a warped shaving mirror to show how ovals turn faces sly and unfamiliar. In the coffeehouse near St. Paul's, where pamphleteers bought tea with opinions and left change in epigrams, the account tilted toward satire. Someone chalked a cartoon of a girl turning from a mirror that reflected, not her, but a bishop's mitre. Laughter went up like spilled gin catching flame. Others saw profit. A hawker on the corner advertised, modest mirrors, little ovals trimmed to show only the crown of the head, guaranteed to discourage vanity. He sold 3 before dusk to clerks who wanted the joke more than the glass. At Henry Whitcomb's counter the air thickened. Customers entered softer, as if stepping into a sick room, and inquired after the child with voices tender enough to bruise. As well as can be expected, Henry said, and the words tasted like failure. He had endured lean quarters, but never one in which pity arrived stapled to every order. He caught himself binding too tightly, as if stricter stitches might hold together what was fraying upstairs. The shop filled with the sour smell of paste and worry. The boys at home grew bold. A new apprentice hid a round mirror beneath tissue on the binding table, hoping to startle Clara and win a laugh. She sensed the trap, a quick breath, the paper lowered and left in place, a retreat so light the stairs scarcely registered it. Henry dismissed the boy before nightfall and docked his wages. Still the tale ran ahead of the correction, returning larger. If even a trick could not wring a glance from her, people said, surely the matter was no ordinary caprice. The Row had its strays. A fortune-teller read palms in a doorway when rain emptied the shop fronts. A failed medical student dispensed laudanum for sorrows he did not understand, a former actor quoted blank verse for pennies and applause. They orbited the Whitcomb story like crows around a glint. The fortune-teller offered, for a fee, to reconcile a stubborn soul with its likeness. The ex-student proclaimed hysteric monomania, and drank his pay. The actor promised an elegy, then forgot the meter halfway through. Through this sediment walked Dr. Elias Corbin. He was not yet of the Royal Society, though he angled toward it like a plant toward a high window. He treated printers' crushed fingers and compositors' coughs, and read late with a pen in his hand until his margins darkened with notes. Mirrors interested him not as moral proofs but as instruments that reversed expectations and returned them altered. He had drafted a paper on anticipatory perception in reflective surfaces. The journal sent it back with kind regrets. Corbin delivered a letter by hand, requesting permission to observe. Henry, exhausted by intrusion, nearly refused. Yet the doctor's voice was careful, and his eyes held the patient's trade men recognize. He brought no mirror, only a portfolio and a tidy habit of silence. In the upstairs room he acknowledged the turned oval and the graphite smudge where Clara sketched by the window. He spoke first of neutral things, the hour the bell seemed loudest, the cat who believed the gutter his estate, the comfort of a chair warmed by the fire. Only then did he ask questions shaped like observations. Did puddles trouble her as much as silvered glass? Were windows worse at dusk? Did the difficulty arrive with a quickening heart or without warning? He did not demand, he invited. Clara's answers were small, but they had edges he could write down. Water was tolerable if it moved, intolerable if still. Lantern light made glass feel deep, as if nothing returned unaltered. The trouble began as a wish not to see and settled into a rule she could not break. When Corbin left he pronounced neither devilry nor cure. He asked only to return. That restraint cooled the row for a day. If a doctor refused both miracle and scandal, perhaps the tale resisted the comfort of names. Yet the presses kept biting and releasing, and London stayed hungry for strangeness. Pamphlets shouted of riots, a steamship mishap, a comet no one would see through fog. By morning the Whitcomb story threaded itself among these louder texts like wire, thin, tensile, easy to ignore until it tightened. And each dusk the upstairs candle stitched its circle of gold, and the girl kept her gaze a hair's breadth aside from her own likeness. The row learned to walk around the fact as one walks around scaffolding, with annoyance, with fascination, with the quiet expectation that something would either be mended or fall. In the meantime the rumor settled into habit, and habit, in London, passes for truth until a louder truth arrives. Outside, the presses kept time, and London listened with its usual, indifferent hunger for marvels before sleep closed over. By the first thaw of February, the Whitcomb's door had become a quiet sort of attraction, not unlike the way curious eyes would linger on a house where a crime had once been committed or where a strange relic was rumored to be kept. It began with the neighbors, then the acquaintances of neighbors, and then strangers entirely, faces that had never before been seen in Paternoster Row, now pausing at the threshold with some pretext for calling. The first were the merely curious, armed with polite smiles and feigned errands. A woman from Newgate Street appeared one morning, claiming to be a friend of Margaret's cousin, asking to borrow a pattern for dress trimmings. While her words were cordial, her eyes wandered continually toward the staircase, as though expecting Clara to appear. When no such appearance came, she lingered overlong, pressing Margaret with questions about the child's health, in tones so falsely warm they were cold. Next came those with the air of amateur physicians and dabblers in the occult, men who had read a volume or two on mesmerism, women who claimed knowledge of mirror maladies from some distant village or foreign land. One such gentleman, tall and pale with an uneven gait, arrived carrying a polished copper plate under his arm. He introduced himself as a practitioner of harmonic sight, and requested permission to show the plate to Clara, insisting it would reveal the harmless nature of her own image. Margaret refused, but he lingered in the hallway, talking of sympathetic vibrations, until Henry firmly ushered him out. It was not always so easy. A pair of sisters from Bishopsgate, their skirts trailing damp from the street, arrived uninvited in the late afternoon, bearing a small oval mirror wrapped in muslin. They claimed to have helped a young boy once who could not look upon his own shadow without fainting. Without asking leave, they began unwrapping the glass in the parlor, their eyes alight with the thrill of intervention. Clara, sensing the intent even from the stairwell, vanished into her room and locked the door. The sisters left in a huff, convinced the family was protecting the illness. Each visit left its mark. Margaret began bolting the door even during daylight hours, answering knocks only after lifting the curtain to see who stood outside. Henry took to leaving a printed notice in the window, no demonstrations, no remedies, though it did little to dissuade the determined. Londoners of that era had a talent for cloaking intrusion in civility. They arrived bearing penny novels, hand pies, or small potted plants, as though such offerings excused the probing questions that followed. There were subtler intrusions too. A gentleman who claimed to be shopping for a Bible lingered in the shop for an hour, buying nothing, but contriving to glance repeatedly toward the door that led upstairs. A printer's apprentice from across the row began timing his errands to coincide with Clara's rare outings, shadowing her from a distance and watching for the moment when she passed any reflective surface. When Henry discovered this, the boy was sent packing with a blackened eye courtesy of his own foreman. The visitors were not always unwelcome in their intent. One evening, a kind-faced midwife named Mrs. Raymond arrived at the door, asking softly if she might speak with Margaret in private. She told of a girl she had delivered 14 years ago in Shoreditch, who, at the age of 12, began to cry whenever she was made to wash her face in the tin basin. The girl claimed the water showed her wrong, though no one could discover in what way. The family eventually moved to the countryside, and the child's aversion eased, though she never again tolerated glass in her bedroom. Mrs. Raymond offered no cure, only the comfort that the affliction might not be permanent. Still, each knock at the door seemed to strip away another layer of the Whitcombs' privacy. Clara withdrew further, avoiding even the front windows lest she be glimpsed by another gawker. She began taking her meals in her room, sketching late into the night by candlelight. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, Margaret would pass by and hear the faint sound of pencil on paper, swift and deliberate, as though the act of drawing was a kind of anchoring in a world she no longer entirely trusted. Henry's patience frayed under the strain. One Saturday, a man in a dark coat appeared at the shop with an absurd proposition, that Clara be brought to a hall in Holborn where an audience might witness her condition in exchange for a share of the proceeds. Henry's response was short, sharp, and final. The man left, muttering about ingratitude, but the damage was done. Henry spent the rest of the day binding books in grim silence, his stitches pulling the leather tight enough to squeak. Among the visitors, a pattern emerged. Each came believing they might be the one to solve the mystery, to coax the girl into looking, to witness the moment she broke her own strange rule. None succeeded. Some left perplexed, others irritated, but all carried the story further afield. And Clara, for her part, became ever more skilled in the art of avoidance. She knew which streets held shop windows and chose alternate routes. She learned to step aside before reaching a puddle. She trained her eyes to settle always on something solid, a wall, a shoe, a folded cloth, rather than risk them straying to a reflective surface. This vigilance lent her movements an almost ceremonial quality, as though she were performing some sacred rite invisible to others. Margaret noticed the toll it was taking. The child's shoulders, once straight, now curved forward, her voice grew softer, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention she could not bear. The visits had made the avoidance not merely a private compulsion but a public performance, one she was forced to maintain under the watchful gaze of others. The Whitcombs began to speak, in private, of removing to another part of the city, perhaps south of the river, where fewer inquired after them. Yet the thought of abandoning the shop, their livelihood, was a heavy one. For now, they endured, bolting the door against the unwanted and hoping the story would burn itself out like a fire starved of air. But in London, stories did not starve so easily. They smoldered, hidden in the ash, ready to flare again when stirred by the right hand. And all it would take, the Row seemed to sense, was one more incident, something undeniable, to bring the curious back in numbers. That incident was coming. Dr. Elias Corbin returned on a morning that smelled of wet rope and coal, the fog thin to gauze that made edges seem merciful. He carried no bag, only a russet notebook and a pencil paired to a wire. Henry admitted him with the courtesy of a tradesman who has learned that help often arrives dressed as inquiry. Upstairs, the fire ticked with little sighs. The oval mirror was turned to the wall. Corbin kept his back to it, remarking on the cathedral bell as if naming a neighbor. Only then did he ask whether he might sit by the window where Clara kept her sketches, only then did he ask if she minded. He began with measures he refused to call experiments. Could she, with her eyes only, trace the outline of the hearth tiles? Could she reconcile the mantel's straight edge with the way it shortened toward the corner? He asked whether the dark metal of a spoon troubled her when held bowl down. It did not. He noted the steadiness of her hand, the speed of her breath when the shutter moved. He asked about sleep, appetite, headaches, shadows at the periphery. Her replies were precise. He wrote them down not as proofs but as weather, conditions to be known before anyone risks the narrow pass. He asked the mirror's name. Is it the glass, he said, or the law that returns you to yourself? She considered the window latch. The law, she answered, and what it permits. He did not press. Instead he spoke of depth cues, of tiny cheats the brain uses when light is meager, the fattening of a shadow, the slur of a contour, the way a reflection can feel like a well when the world grows flat. Some minds lean toward such wells, he said, the way the tired lean toward sleep. His sentences were gentle instruments, and they did not ask her to be ashamed. Margaret listened from the doorway, hands nested. Corbin asked to angle the window so the outside world smeared instead of returning upon itself. Clara agreed with a tight nod. He turned the sash, the glass became milk, the street no more than brightness and drift. Is this tolerable? He asked. For now, she said. He told her a dockside story, a sailor who could not step onto a gangplank when the river lay still. The remedy had been motion. A rope dragged through water gave the surface back its plainness. Did motion soothe her? She admitted a stirred basin was kinder than a still one, and lamplight wavering on a pane felt less like a second room and more like wind through hedges. Henry wanted bluntness. Is she ill? Corbin chose thread with care. She is suffering, he said, and the suffering has rules. Rules can sometimes be bargained with. He proposed modest trials, a schedule as plain as a diet. Each afternoon, for a slow count of 30, Clara would look at the window from a distance where its image was useless. On rainy evenings she would watch the pane until the wavering unstitched. The oval mirror would remain banished. Force teaches the mind to treat obedience as defeat, he warned. Before leaving he produced a square of black card with a pinhole pricked through. He asked Clara to hold it to one eye and look at the window latch, the latch sharpened unnaturally, the room reduced to a single obedient point. A reminder, he said, that the eye can choose what to keep. The roe could not digest so quiet a medicine. The curate called it evasion, the spectacle seller called it sense, the apprentices waited for brighter calamity. Inside the Whitcomb house the hours acquired ceremony, counts of 30, trials of gaze, the small heroism of not running. Clara learned the terrain of her own refusal as a map, where to step, where not, how to rest between. On the second day the fog relented and sunlight struck the glass, turning it to a hard coin. Clara looked aside until the fever of it passed. At dusk she stood where the parlor mirror once glowered and studied the blank wall like a healed wound. She could not say whether she had improved, only that the rules had grown clearer. Corbin returned when promised. Henry could not help measuring the plan as if it were a ledger. 30 counts, 3 days, 2 cards, 1 promise not to force, numbers steadied him, the space between them felt perilous. He sat at the binding table, cutting boards square as if drawn by compass, and listened to the house learning its new rhythm. Margaret moved with a tread, relieved by the absence of spectacle yet startled that hope could bruise. When Clara completed a count without flinching, Margaret's breath left her in a soft rush. When she faltered, the silence afterwards seemed louder than any sob. Corbin heard the ledger of attempts, nodded at failure as if it were expected, and left a second card with a narrower hole. Diminish the world, he advised, until it removes its claim upon you. Later, Clara held the card to the candle. The flame became a tame star behind the aperture. She did not look toward the turned mirror, but her refusal felt less like a commandment and more like a choice that might one day be unchosen. That night she dreamed of windows opening into fog and of a river whose surface was stitched with rain. In the dream she walked beside it without fear, carrying her face like a folded letter, present, sealed. She woke before dawn to the distant bell and the soft complaint of the fire. The city went on, and the bargain held for one more day. By the spring of 1845, Clara's name had drifted beyond the narrow courts of Paternoster Row, carried on a current not of newspapers but of mouths, those unrecorded presses that stamp tales into the memory of a city. She had become, to people who had never seen her, a figure in the London of half-light, the girl who turned from her own reflection. And with distance came invention. Folklore, like fog, thickens as it spreads. The further the tale traveled, the less it resembled the Wickham's actual life. In the East End, a fishmonger told customers she'd been cursed by a beggar whose coin she refused. In Clerkenwell, a washerwoman swore her aunt had seen Clara's reflection move a moment slower than her body. And in Southwark, a man at a gin shop claimed the girl had once looked into a mirror and seen not her own face, but a stranger's, one smiling when she was not. London was, in those years, a city rich in the currency of superstition. The old beliefs had not yet been entirely swept aside by gaslight and iron. Mirrors, in particular, held a long ledger of dread. In country villages, they were covered when someone died, lest the departing soul become trapped in the glass. Children were told to avoid looking into a mirror by candlelight, for fear they might see the devil grinning back. Sailors carried small bits of broken mirror as charms, while miners swore that a cracked looking glass foretold collapse. Even in the capital's more educated circles, there lingered the idea that reflections could reveal more than they ought. Spiritualist societies were beginning to sprout in drawing rooms from Bloomsbury to Mayfair. These were not yet the full-blown séances of the coming decades, but quiet gatherings where tea cooled beside darkened mirrors, and guests watched the glass for signs of another presence. In such a climate, Clara's refusal to look was not merely peculiar, it was a refusal to participate in what some believed was a gateway. Within Paternoster Row itself, the speculation took on a more personal tone. Mrs. Pennington, the tea seller, suggested to anyone who would listen that Clara might have been born under a rare moon, her spirit unbalanced by some celestial misalignment. The printer's apprentices, having exhausted the joke of vanity, began telling one another that she must be mirror fay, a changeling whose reflection would betray her as not wholly human. They told this with relish to newcomers, always lowering their voices on the word fay, as though the walls might hear. Margaret, though not inclined toward superstition, could not avoid hearing these scraps. She would return from the market with her basket heavy and her thoughts heavier, the weight of half-truths pressing at the edges of her composure. Sometimes, when she passed the covered mirror in the parlor, she found herself glancing away too, not out of fear, but because the thing had become a symbol of strain. Henry, for his part, grew irritated by the persistence of the talk. He had been raised in a family that prized order and evidence, his trade was one of precision, not fancies. Yet even he could not wholly shake the unease that superstition breeds when it is repeated often enough. There were nights when he woke and thought of the oval mirror upstairs, wondering, not believing, but wondering, whether it might hold something more than its plain walnut frame suggested. Corbin, the physician, remained steadfastly unmoved by such notions. But even he recognized that the weight of belief could press upon a patient as tangibly as any fever. On one of his visits, he brought Clara a slim folio of etchings, old European tales of mirrors, drawn with a care that made the grotesque beautiful. There were lovers meeting in the glass, only one of whom had a shadow, there was a queen whose reflection aged decades in a single night, there was a boy who stepped into his own image and never returned. Clara turned the pages slowly, her fingers hovering just above the ink. "These are stories," she said. "Yes," Corbin replied. "And stories are not the same as truths. But they can behave as truths, if enough people lend them their eyes." She looked at him for a long moment, as though weighing whether to ask the question forming in her mind. When she spoke, it was without expression. "Do they behave as truths even when you don't believe them?" Corbin considered this. "They can," he said. "But knowing they are only stories is like knowing where the shore is when you swim. You may still be carried by the current, but you remember there is ground beneath." Outside the Whitcombs' home, London moved in its usual mingling of progress and persistence. Omnibuses rumbled past the cathedral, their painted panels gleaming when the sun broke through. Gas lamps hissed in the damp. And at the edges of conversation, in markets, in workshops, at church doors, the girl in Paternoster Row continued to appear, her image refracted through the prisms of other people's fears and fascinations. Some spoke of her with pity, others with relish, and a few with a hint of envy. After all, how many ordinary lives became the subject of such lingering attention? But for Clara, the attention was a tightening circle. Even on days when she was not directly confronted, she could feel the air change when she entered a room, as though every reflective surface were watching her on behalf of someone else. That sensation deepened one evening when, passing a narrow alley, she heard a woman's voice call her name. Turning, she saw a figure in the shadows, a bent old woman with a bundle of cloth. The woman beckoned her closer and, with a thin smile, unwrapped the bundle to reveal a small, tarnished mirror. "You must look, child," the woman crooned, "or the not looking will claim you." Clara froze, the blood draining from her face. She stepped back, shaking her head, and the woman's smile twisted into something sour. "Then you've already begun," she said, and pulled the cloth back over the mirror before melting into the dark. When Clara told her mother what had happened, Margaret forbade her from walking unaccompanied. Yet the warning did little to ease Clara's mind. For the first time, the refusal no longer felt entirely her own, it felt like something outside her was pulling the strings, as if her decision had been co-opted by the very superstition she resisted. In the weeks that followed, the fog returned, thick and clinging. On some mornings, it was so dense that the dome of St. Paul's vanished entirely, replaced by a pale emptiness that seemed to swallow sound. In that muffled world, mirrors became even stranger things. A surface that returned your image in daylight now offered only the suggestion of a face, a ghost of yourself in floating fragments. For those inclined toward the uncanny, it was proof enough that such objects belonged to the realm of stories. And so Clara's legend grew, not because she changed, but because the city had decided how to see her. By late autumn the city behaved like a room that had forgotten its windows. Days shortened, sounds arrived late, colors retreated into pewter. Inside the Whitcomb house, Clara's refusal hardened into habit, and habit into law. What began as unease became vigilance that threaded every hour. Tin plates were stacked face down. The kettle's belly faced the wall. Pitchers wore lids except when pouring. The parlor mirror stayed turned, its walnut back a mute shield. Even the modest shine on polished wood could arrest her for a breath, as if brightness itself were an invitation she must decline. Margaret tried to soften the edges. She stitched dim sleeves for candlesticks so flame would not kiss the glass of frames or cabinets. She pasted paper squares over the hallway mirror and, later, over a glazed print of a ship that kept returning the parlor to itself whenever the fire burned high. She spoke gently, then firmly, then not at all. Her voice, once brisk with household purpose, took on the careful hush of the sickroom, though none in the house dared use that word. Henry counted in quarters and rents. Customers still came, but more slowly, as if courtesy had to shoulder past curiosity. He told himself that trade falters in damp weather anyway. Yet at night his mind rehearsed the arithmetic of leaving, the loss on shop fittings, the uncertain profit of a less notorious address, the insult of empty windows if word followed them across the river. He lay awake beside his sleeping wife and watched the ceiling disappear into dark, feeling numbers fail like wet twine. Clara grew thinner. Not starved, not ill in the ways that summon medicine chests, but worn at the edges, as if constant watching sanded her down. She ate dutifully, she walked when asked, she glued torn end papers in her father's back room. Still there was a pinch to her concentration, and a hesitation where floors shone. The harp sheen of varnish could stop her a heartbeat too long, and in that beat her breath shortened, as though the world had suddenly asked her a question she could not answer. Corbin's regimen continued. Counts of 30, then 40. Pinhole cards the size of a calling card. The window made milk by a slow breath across it. He recorded tolerances as a navigator marks soundings. Some days brought easing, dusk felt kinder if a fire burned elsewhere, a bowl of water became endurable if a fingertip traced ripples. Other days erased gains. A lamplighter paused and the pane turned to a coin, the count restarted, Clara's shoulders rose and stayed. Beyond the house, belief and explanation kept trading places like actors between scenes. The curate returned with a folded sermon that asked for fasting and prayer. Henry agreed to prayer and refused fasting. The spectacle seller recommended smoked glass cut to ovals for practice, as one might school a skittish horse. A pamphleteer made Clara's case a moral fable with a tidy ending if she would only repent looking. Henry bought the sheet, read it by the shop door, and fed it to the fire with tongs. The season narrowed. Frost silvered the threshold at dawn, chimneys coughed, the dome vanished and returned like a thought one cannot hold. With each shortening day, the house tilted inward, as if London leaned on it. Clara began to avoid more than mirrors. She would not look at freshly polished cutlery or the black surface of tea before it swirled. She angled past the glass doors of a bookseller's cabinet. She turned portraits to the wall when Margaret was not looking, ashamed of the impulse even as she obeyed it. Neighbors felt the gravity and drew their own ellipses. Some crossed the street to avoid meeting her eyes, as if misfortune could ride on breath. Others knocked with casseroles and correction disguised as care. "A girl needs occupation," said one, delivering a basket of mending. "An idle mind invents demons." Margaret thanked her and sat late with the needle, because the kindness needed somewhere to land and because the sound of thread through cloth made the room seem ordinary for a while. There were days when the house felt briefly reconciled to its new laws. Clara completed her counts, Margaret read aloud until dusk, the cat slept like a rolled glove by the grate. Then a chance glint would split the hour, the bowl set down at the wrong angle, a bead of water on a spoon, and the silence would tear. Clara did not cry out. She closed her eyes and turned her head an inch, as if dodging a blow that refused to land. Afterward she apologized to no one in particular, a habit that wounded Margaret more than any scene might have done. Thomas visited with printer's ink still in the webbing of his fingers and argued, without conviction, that a change of air would cure everything. Lydia, newly certain of a wedding date, tried to braid news of dresses and invitations into the afternoon's talk, hoping that ceremony might dilute affliction. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the room swallowed the words whole, leaving only the tick of the clock and the low complaint of the grate. One evening, sleet rattled the panes like thrown rice. The parlor fire burned small and blue. Henry, flushed by a day of petty humiliations, proposed the experiment he had sworn to avoid. "Only a glance," he said, hand on the cloth that hid the mantel mirror. "Only to show there is nothing to fear." His voice sought the old authority of the father who could fix hinges and balances by touch. Margaret stood very still. "We made terms," she reminded him, quieter than the fire. Clara, tracing lines on scrap paper, did not rise. "Please," she said, not pleading so much as setting the last bead on an abacus. Corbin's warning held, force teaches the mind to treat obedience as defeat. Henry's hand fell. He stirred the fire instead and apologized in a voice she had not used for him since childhood, a voice that made the floor feel steadier underfoot. That night Clara woke from a thin sleep and sat by the window. Fog pressed against the glass, turning the outside world into white breath. She held the smallest pinhole card to her eye. Through it the candle steadied into a star. The star reassured her not because it was pretty, but because it was single. She thought, wildly, that if she could narrow the world enough she might learn to look at anything. Days bled one into the next. The city rang with winter errands, cold deliveries, the slap of wet newspapers on stone, boots scraping thresholds. In the shop, Henry's hands worked, precise as ever. He taught a new apprentice to square the text block by habit. The boy listened carefully, fearful of error in a house that sounded like a held breath. There were small mercies. Lydia arrived with ribbons that needed choosing. Thomas brought a tin soldier for the cat to bat. The rattle made Clara laugh once, quick and surprised, as if music had mislaid a note and found it again. That sound put strength back in Margaret's spine for a day. Yet the vigilance did not loosen. The season turned, but inside their rooms time stayed taut as string. When the first snow fell clean enough to reflect the sky, Clara watched it dull to grey with relief. She slept a fraction more. She kept the mirror turned. And London drew its coat tighter, preparing for the coldest weeks, while the Whitcomb house bent, unbroken, under its patient, private weather. It was the sort of night that seemed to have been written in advance, the kind where the fog rolls low over the rooftops and the city moves in muffled motions, as though afraid to disturb whatever waits in the shadows. The streets had emptied early, even the market criers had long since gone silent. Inside the Whitcomb house, the fire in the parlour had burned down to a dull red glow, and the clock ticked with a sound too loud for such a small room. Margaret had left only moments before, pulling her shawl close as she stepped out to deliver a jar of broth to Mrs. Pennington, who had taken ill. The visit would be brief, 10 minutes at most, and Clara had been content to stay behind, perched in her usual place at the window seat with her sketchbook open across her lap. The oval mirror upstairs remained turned to the wall, as it had been for months, but even in its absence Clara carried the awareness of it, the way one remembers a door behind them in a dark hallway. Henry was still in the shop, tallying the week's accounts by the light of a single candle. The sound of his pen scratching across the ledger was steady, unhurried. Down the hall, the cat slept curled on the hearth rug, tail twitching at some private dream. The house, in short, was still. It was from that stillness that the first sound came, a faint metallic tap, like the clink of a button against glass. Clara paused, pencil hovering over the paper. The sound came again, slightly louder, and this time it seemed to come from upstairs. She told herself it was the wind worrying at a loose shutter or perhaps the cat knocking something over, but she knew the cat was not upstairs. Her feet moved before she had fully decided to go. The staircase groaned beneath her weight, the boards cold through the thin soles of her slippers. At the top landing, she stopped, straining to hear. The tapping had ceased, but there was another sound now, an almost inaudible humming, low and even, like the murmur of someone thinking aloud to themselves. The door to her bedroom stood ajar. A pale slice of candlelight spilled across the floorboards. She pushed the door wider and saw, to her astonishment, that every mirror in the house, hers, her mother's small hand mirror, even the rectangular hallway glass, now stood propped inside her room. Some leaned against the walls, others sat balanced on chairs, all of them angled inward as though forming a silent congregation. In the center of the room, on the narrow rug, stood the oval mirror from her dressing table. The muslin cloth that had been draped over it for weeks lay crumpled on the floor. The glass caught the candlelight, sending it skittering across the ceiling in strange, broken shapes. Clara felt her breath quicken. She took a step forward, then another. In each mirror she saw the same thing, the room, the candle, the other mirrors, but not herself. Where she should have been was only a thin distortion, as though the glass could not quite decide what to make of her. The humming grew louder, and it took her several moments to realize it came from her own throat, unbidden, a soft droning that she could not seem to stop. Her hands had begun to tremble, though she was not cold. She reached for the oval mirror as if to turn it toward the wall, but her fingers hovered above the frame, caught between instinct and an odd compulsion to leave it exactly as it was. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned sharply, expecting to see her father, but the doorway was empty. The humming faltered, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against her ears. She gathered the muslin from the floor and draped it back over the oval mirror. The moment the cloth settled, the distortions in the other mirrors shifted. They no longer seemed to struggle with her absence but instead reflected her as a shadow at the very edge of their frames, faint and insubstantial. She backed toward the door, careful not to meet her own eyes, and closed it behind her with a quiet click. When Margaret returned minutes later, she found Clara sitting in the parlor beside the sleeping cat, sketchbook open, face pale but otherwise composed. "You're quiet," Margaret remarked, unwinding her shawl. Clara only nodded. She did not mention the mirrors, nor the humming, nor the strange absence of her reflection. It was only later, when Margaret went upstairs to fetch a candle from Clara's room, that she noticed the muslin hanging askew over the oval mirror and the faint smear of fingerprints along its frame. The other mirrors, too, seemed slightly displaced, as though they had been moved and then hurriedly returned. She said nothing to Henry, telling herself there was no sense in giving shape to something she could not explain. But that night, after the household had gone to bed, she found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking of the way the mirrors had been arranged, all facing inward, as though they had been waiting for something, or someone, to stand among them. Downstairs, the clock ticked. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the glass. And in her narrow bed, Clara lay with her eyes open long after the candle burned out, feeling the peculiar certainty that the house, for all its brick and timber, was not entirely sealed against whatever had happened in her room that night. From that evening forward, she began closing her bedroom door more firmly, and Margaret noticed she avoided being upstairs alone after dark. The avoidance had deepened into something more than a quirk or a fear, it had become a quiet law of survival. And though nothing in the house was said aloud, all three members of the family seemed to sense that the strange night in February marked a turning. The air in the Whitcomb home felt subtly altered, like a book whose spine had been cracked, no page yet missing. But something in its binding forever changed. It happened in early March, while a crust of old snow still stubborned the gutters and the sky could not decide between rain and ash. The day was a Monday, ordinary by every visible measure. Henry rose early to fetch a shipment of calfskin and left the shop door chained. Margaret took stock of flour and coal and planned a stew. Clara seemed quieter than usual, but not unwell. She ate toast without complaint, folded her napkin with careful thumbs, and asked, almost casually, whether she might spend the morning upstairs drawing. Margaret agreed, grateful for any wish that did not involve retreat. She reminded Clara to keep the fire modest and to crack the window if smoke grew sulky. Clara nodded, the little pinhole card tucked into her sketchbook like a pressed leaf. The house resumed the grammar of a plain day. Just after 10 a reluctant snow began, whispering along the panes. The street sounded distant, wrapped in wool. Every so often Margaret heard a chair scoot, the pause of a pencil, the soft thud of a book returned to its place. Normal sounds, she told herself, the comfort of known punctuation. At 11:30 the bell at St. Paul's tolled the half-hour with a damp, undecided tone. Margaret wiped her hands and climbed the narrow stairs to ask if Clara wanted tea. The landing smelled faintly of charcoal. Her daughter's door was closed. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again and pressed her ear to the wood. Silence, no pencil, no chair leg, no breath heeding the crack at the threshold. She opened the door. The room held the shape of its owner the way a glove holds the memory of a hand. The oval mirror's walnut back faced the bed, the muslin cover had slipped a finger's width, like a tired eyelid. On the dressing table lay the sketchbook, open to quick, anxious lines that gathered into what might have been a window seen through fog. On the bed lay Clara's shawl. On the floor, near the edge of the rug, lay the pinhole card. The window latch was lifted. The right-hand sash stood 2 inches open, and snow, fine as sifted flour, had powdered the sill. Margaret felt the draught touch her throat like a cold spoon. She lowered the sash, it yielded with a small, injured squeal. She peered into the narrow airshaft that served 3 neighboring houses. No ladder. No rope. No prints on the ledge. Only the clean, unbroken skin the morning had laid down. Clara? She did not mean to whisper. The name fell out of her like a coin from a torn pocket. She called again, louder. The house gave back only small domestications, the beetle scurry of the fire downstairs, a hidden drip, the faint complaint of timber remembering summer. A quiver began in her knees. She searched systematically, because order is a plank in bad water. The wardrobe, dresses that breathed soap. Under the bed, dust, a button, the stub of a candle rolled to the skirting. The washstand, the basin empty, the pitcher warm from the grate. The little closet where Trunk slept, locked as always, the key on its nail. No Clara. She checked the landing, Lydia's old room, the stair, the space behind the curtain. Nothing. Henry returned at noon to find his wife at the bottom of the steps with both hands to her mouth. He did not ask what was wrong, he knew. He climbed 2 at a time, entered the room, and took in the facts with the ruthless balance of a tradesman, a shawl abandoned without reason, a sash displaced, a draught where none should be, a page left breathing on the table. They searched again, now clumsy with urgency, opening drawers as if a girl might fold herself like linen. Henry went to the yard, to the alley, to the neighbor's kitchen door. He leaned into the airshaft and looked up, half expecting to see a hem vanish around a square of sky. Nothing moved but the snow. By 2 o'clock the row understood that something had slipped awry. Neighbors came, first shyly, then with the steadiness of people who require work for their hands. Mrs. Pennington set water to boil. The foreman from the printing house organized a methodical search with the brisk pity of a man used to accidents. The curate arrived unbidden and offered words that sounded like prayers but felt like rules recited too late. Apprentices peered into coal stores and under carts. A constable took names and times with a blunt pencil and a notebook that smelled of damp leather. Theories multiplied to fill the space where the girl should have been. A fall. A flight. A lure. A mistake. Margaret shook her head at each, because none fitted the seam of the morning. There was no smear on the sill, no scuff at the baseboard, no chair dragged to the window. The room bore witness only to presence, and then to absence, with nothing granted to explain the hinge. On the dressing table the sketchbook lay open. Henry could not bear to look and could not stop. The drawing was perhaps a window or perhaps an eye, lines wove inward and broke off, as if the hand had refused a center. On the next page, he turned it like a verdict, was a face, Clara's, in quick charcoal, unfinished. The mouth was resolute, the hair pulled back, the chin too strong, as children sometimes draw themselves sturdier than they are. The eyes were blanks, ovals left untouched. He closed the book and placed his palm on it, as if warmth could coax a pupil back onto the page. Toward evening, as the light went tin-gray, a boy from the end of the row came running with a report that found purchase and then slid off. He had seen a girl cross Bread Street just after 11, he said, head low, shawlless. When pressed, he could not say the color of her dress or whether she limped or how her hair lay. Like a girl, he finished, and the constable wrote it anyway. Snow thickened, then relented. The searchers dwindled, not because hope had failed but because London never gives a full day to a single sorrow. The city must turn its wheels. Henry barred the door because action felt mandatory. Margaret moved with a lamp, straightening what did not require straightening. In Clara's room she paused before the turned mirror. With a careful hand she lifted the edge of the muslin and let it fall again. The gesture meant nothing and everything. That night neither parent slept. Every sound belonged to Clara. The cold settling was her foot on the stair, the wind's purse against the sash was her breath, the far bell was her voice reporting from a distance England does not measure. Toward morning, when exhaustion shook Margaret so hard her teeth knocked, she stood at the window. The air shaft lay blank and innocent. By noon the following day the row wore its grief like a uniform. Some spoke softly, others too loudly, everyone eyed glass. Rumor, starved of facts, feasted on symbols. A cracked tumbler in the tea shop predicted return, a tray that refused to brighten predicted the opposite. The Whitcomb shop stayed closed. A card in the window read closed for family matter in a hand too steady to be honest. 2 days later Corbin arrived, grey with sleeplessness he had not earned but accepted like debt. He examined the room without touching anything. He asked Henry to recount the timings until the story lost its muscles and lay flat. He measured the sill with a string, the distance to the nearest outcropping brick, the width of the airshaft's throat. Then he stood at the window and, without turning, asked Margaret whether Clara had ever spoken of wanting to be rid of the rule rather than bound by it, whether she had longed for the sight she refused. She wanted to be ordinary, Margaret said. She wanted the world to return itself. Corbin left no comfort, only the integrity of not pretending. He told the constable what he could swear and what he could not. He asked for a watch to be kept at night along the row, not because he expected a return but because watching is the last courtesy one offers a vanishing. The constable promised what constables promise, that paper would be moved, that boots would be used. London moved as London moves. By week's end the story had sprouted versions, the girl spirited through the glass, the girl taken by white slavers, the girl who stepped into fog and found it a door. Each retelling soldered the absence a little more securely to the city's imagination. In the Whitcomb house the air changed timbre, as if the rooms had learned to speak more quietly. Clara Whitcomb had stepped out of a room that remembered every inch of her and left behind only cold air, a shawl, a card with a pinprick, and a drawing that refused to give her eyes. The city, that maker and eater of stories, swallowed the fact and waited to see what kind of tale it would shape. Waiting, in London, is never idle. It grinds private losses into coins fit for public talk, and it does not ask permission. And so a household became a rumor, and a rumor began its slow ascent toward legend. Night held its careful breath. In the days that followed Clara's disappearance, the row changed in ways that were visible only to those who had lived its patterns long enough to notice the absences. The air seemed to thicken just outside the Whitcomb shop, as if sound itself hesitated there. The familiar calls of the apprentices, the jangle of delivery carts, even the deep, steady bell of street palls seemed to pass more quickly, unwilling to linger near the address where a girl had vanished without a footprint. The shop remained shut. Henry left the sign in the window, closed for family matter, in a firm hand, but its edges curled in the damp, and the ink began to bleed. The blinds stayed half drawn. Passers-by would glance at them, then away, as though to look too long might invite the kind of luck that could not be undone. Inside, the Whitcombs moved as though underwater. Henry busied himself with repairs that did not need doing, regluing the spines of already sound books, replacing the leather on tools that had years left in them. His work became a metronome, each cut and stitch measured, precise, and entirely without joy. Margaret drifted between rooms carrying teacups that cooled untouched, starting tasks and abandoning them mid-gesture. In the absence of her youngest child, she seemed unsure where to put her hands. The constable had come and gone, leaving polite instructions and the faint smell of wet wool in his wake. He returned twice more, each visit shorter than the last, his questions dulling at the edges. By the end of the week, his notes were less about facts than about the lack of them, no sightings, no witnesses, no sign of struggle. Sometimes they reappear, he had said, though his tone made it clear he had no such expectation. What the constable could not contain was the story's spread. Paternoster Row had been a tight knot of rumor even before Clara's condition, now, her vanishing had loosened tongues until the air was thick with speculation. In the tea shop, Mrs. Pennington lowered her voice to declare that Clara had been taken through the looking-glass, her absence the inevitable end to months of avoidance. At the printing house, the apprentices favored a more worldly tale, that she had run away with a mysterious figure glimpsed once on Bread Street, a man with a cane and a crooked smile. The more fanciful claimed to see signs in the very glass of the Row. A warped window in the milliner's shop was said to hold a fleeting image of her face, though no two reports agreed on the expression. Some swore she smiled, others that she wept, still others that her mouth moved without sound, as though warning those who watched. One evening, a boy claimed the parlor mirror in the Whitcombs' house had cracked from corner to corner with a noise like a pistol shot. Margaret, when asked, denied it, but she did not invite anyone inside to confirm. For Henry, the gossip was an abrasion he could not defend against. He took to slipping out at odd hours to fetch supplies or walk the length of Ludgate Hill without speaking to a soul. He began avoiding the eyes of the men he had worked beside for years. Their expressions, whether pitying or curious, felt like demands he could not meet. Margaret's isolation took a quieter form. She stayed mostly indoors, rising at night to walk the empty rooms, pausing at Clara's door but never crossing the threshold. Once, in the small hours, she thought she heard the faint scrape of a chair upstairs, the whisper of paper turning. She stood in the hall, listening until her ears rang, but the house gave her nothing more. Corbin visited twice. On the first occasion, he asked permission to examine Clara's sketches again, as though the lines might have altered in her absence. He found the same faces without eyes, the same unfinished windows, the same swirls that might be fog or smoke. On the second, he brought no notebook, only sat in the parlor with Henry for an hour, saying little, his silence a kind of shared language. Before leaving, he advised that the mirror upstairs remain as it was, covered, turned. Sometimes objects hold the wrong kind of attention, he said. Best not to give them the stage. By the second week, the visitors stopped. London had other distractions, fires, accidents, a scandal in the East End. The Whitcombs' grief receded from the city's front page, as it were, to the back, then to a footnote. Only in the Row did the story persist, softer now, folded into the fabric of the place. Children were told not to linger near the Whitcombs' door, though none could explain why. A superstition grew in the market: if you looked too long into any shop window after dark, you might not see yourself at all. Henry reopened the shop after a fortnight, not from readiness but from necessity. The first day passed in near silence, the customers polite, their voices muted as though in a sick room. Business was slow, but coins changed hands, and for a few moments at a time, the act of measuring leather or trimming boards allowed him to believe the world still had structure. Margaret tried to find comfort in the routines of the household, polishing the candlesticks, mending shirts, keeping the fire alive, but the air of the place remained altered. Even the cat moved differently, padding from room to room as if searching for something it could not name. At night, the house felt larger than it should, its corners darker, its silences deeper. Once, during a rare clear evening, Margaret stood at the window and saw the street reflected in the glass. For a moment she thought she saw Clara's figure in the reflection, standing not in the street but somewhere behind her, in the room. She turned sharply, but the space was empty. After that, she kept the curtains drawn before sunset. The Row learned to live alongside the absence. A nod to Henry in the morning, a wordless loaf left at the door, the quiet turning away of eyes when Margaret passed. And somewhere, in the layered murmur of the city, Clara's name continued, lighter now, a thread among thousands, but always with the faint shimmer of glass around it. Inside the Whitcomb house, her room remained as she had left it, the shawl folded on the bed, the sketchbook closed, the mirror turned to the wall. Dust gathered slowly on the muslin cover. No one touched it. It was as if the family, the Row, and perhaps even the city had agreed, without ever saying so, that some doors are best left closed, and some reflections, once refused, should not be called back. Years later, when the Row had changed its face and the Whitcombs were gone, Clara's name would still surface in the talk of those who had been there in 1845. It never arrived on the tongue as a fact, only as a question disguised as a memory. People spoke of her the way one might speak of a street that no longer exists, you could walk the space it had been, but the air felt different there. There were those who clung to the simplest explanation. A runaway, they said, and nothing more. These were the traders and clerks who had lived long enough in London to know that people vanished from it with the same unremarkable regularity that coins disappeared from pockets. They imagined her boarding a coach under a false name, finding work in some far parish, or perhaps making her way to the coast where no one asked questions. But even the most pragmatic admitted the particulars didn't fit: the open sash, the undisturbed snow, the absence of any preparation. She had left with nothing but what she wore. Others leaned into the shape of the strangeness. For them, the mirror was not a detail but the heart of the matter. They recalled, accurately or not, how Clara's eyes had always slid away from glass, how she had moved as if avoiding some invisible wire strung between her and her own image. They wondered aloud whether she had seen something once, months before, that had set the refusal in motion. Some went further, claiming that what she saw had not been herself at all, but a second life, waiting in the glass, patient and exact. Among the more credulous, the story became a piece of London folklore. In their version, the girl's avoidance was a ward, and the night without reflection was a breach. Once the mirrors in her room had gathered together, they said, the ward failed. Her absence, in this telling, was a matter of reclamation. The glass had simply taken back what had been refusing it. A cracked hand mirror found in a dustbin 2 streets away was presented as proof, though no one could agree on whether the smudge on it was a fingerprint or just the residue of years. Corbin never wrote publicly about the case, though his notes, discovered decades later among his papers, offered several measured possibilities. One was a form of visual disturbance brought on by trauma, leading to both avoidance of reflective surfaces and a heightened susceptibility to suggestion. Another was what he called deliberate sensory restriction, a method by which a person might narrow their perceptual field to control anxiety, but which could, over time, distort judgment and memory. And in the final pages, there was a third possibility, a departure by deliberate design, the motives known only to the subject, who may have found in her own absence the resolution that life, as given, could not offer. He left that one without elaboration. Margaret and Henry never moved the mirror from Clara's room. When they left the Row 2 years later, they took it with them, wrapped in the same muslin, and stored it in the attic of a smaller house south of the river. According to a neighbor there, the muslin was never removed, and dust settled thickly over it. After Henry's death, Margaret returned to her sister's home in Islington, taking only clothing and a small box of family papers. The mirror did not follow. The house on Paternoster Row changed hands more than once before the century's end. Some tenants stayed only a season, citing drafts or odd acoustics. A stationer who took the shop in 1861 claimed that on winter evenings the upstairs window reflected the street as it had been 20 years before, horse carts and all, but never showed the face of the one looking out. His account, printed in a penny journal, revived the story for a season before fading again into the city's deeper murmurs. Even in its quieter years, the tale had a way of resurfacing when conditions were right. A sudden cold snap, a fog that blanketed the Row, or the accidental shattering of a mirror in a shop window could bring it back into conversation. A generation later, children played a game they called Clara's Rule, in which one player had to move through a room without letting their eyes touch any reflective surface. The game ended when someone shouted "vanished," and the losing player had to leave the room. Most did so laughing. A few left unsettled. By the turn of the century, the city had shifted enough that the Row's old shops were nearly unrecognizable, and those who remembered the Whitcombs were fewer each year. Yet the legend remained anchored in place. Visitors to St. Paul's sometimes heard it from guides who swore it was true. A 1904 anthology of London mysteries included it alongside stories of haunted alleys and phantom hansom cabs. In that version, Clara had been seen one final time, not in London at all, but in a remote Cornish village, staring into the tide pools at low water. She was said to have smiled before walking into the sea. Whether that ending was invention or a fragment of some other story grafted onto hers, it satisfied something in those who heard it. People prefer mysteries that resolve into images, and a girl walking into the sea is easier to picture than a sash open to falling snow and nothing else. The house itself was lost in the fire of 1940, the mirror with it. What remained were only the documents, a few constable's notes, Corbyn's private pages, and a small handful of drawings preserved by a cousin of Lydia's. In one of them, the oval of the mirror is sketched in fine, hesitant lines. The glass inside is blank, but around its edge the shading grows darker, as if the reflection were not missing, but hidden. Today, when the story is told at all, it is usually shortened to its simplest form, a girl in 1845 who would not look in a mirror and then one day was gone. But in the older tellings, the kind you might hear from someone whose grandfather had a shop on the row, there is always a pause before the ending, as though the speaker were still deciding whether to offer you the comfortable version or the one that leaves the air in the room slightly changed. And in that pause, long enough for your mind to picture the snow on the sill, the sketchbook open to its eyeless face, the cloth slipping from the mirror, you may find yourself glancing, just once, at whatever glass is nearest. Not to check your reflection. Just to be sure it's there.